In this video, you will learn how incredibly tough and cruel the daily life of a medieval archer in Europe was. You may be surprised to learn that the skeletal remains of some archers show bone deformities. For example, the elbow joint on one hand used to be up to 48% larger than the other. This is the result of a lifetime of training with a bow of absolutely extreme draw strength. So what was the life of a man who mastered a bow and arrow so well that he could change the outcome of battles? Prepare for a journey to the Middle Ages full of surprising facts, hard work, and the fight for your life. The reality of archers was much harsher than you might imagine. Medieval archers played a key role in many European battles and conflicts throughout the centuries. Bows and arrows have been used in warfare since the early Middle Ages, for example by the Normans in the 11th century. They deployed archers at the Battle of Hastings, 1066, as evidenced by the famous tapestry from Bayeux depicting Norman horsemen and archers. Over time, the importance of rifle units grew, especially due to the improvement of weapons. In the 12th century, the deadly crossbow became widespread, capable of piercing even knightly armor. This weapon was so feared that the Second Lateran Council in 1139 declared it, along with archery, a murderous art hated by God, and forbade its use against Christians. The Church therefore considered archery weapons to be dishonorable and too cruel, mainly because they allowed an ordinary peasant to kill a noble knight from a distance, which overturned the social order for the people of that time. Despite Church prohibitions, however, archers became indispensable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, every major army in Europe had its own archers. The English kings particularly relied on the longbow, a simple but very effective high bow made of yew wood. English and Welsh archers trained in the use of the longbow were able to inflict crushing losses on French knights in the battles of the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453, for example. In the battles of Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, thousands of arrows showered the French nobles with a deadly steel whirlwind and shattered their attacks. Many archers learned to shoot in rhythm with commands and work together in formation. In medieval England, shooting competitions were held at fairs, where archers measured their strength, something like today's sports archery. Winning could bring a small reward and prestige. Such a struggle maintained motivation and made the habit both fun and an honorable duty. And it was indeed a duty. We know from the surviving laws that anyone who avoided archery risked punishment. The hard drill from childhood eventually created an elite of shooters who could fire 8 to 12 arrows per minute at a distance of hundreds of meters. We can imagine that. Quickly draw arrow after arrow, rest on the string, strain with all your muscles, and then again. After a few minutes of such a cadence, the archer's muscles were already burning with exhaustion. But a trained shooter had to endure it even in combat when his life was at stake. Once he had mastered the art of shooting, another challenge awaited him. Equip yourself for war and head out into the field. We will show you what equipment an archer wore into battle and what style he actually fought in the next part. The medieval archer certainly did not go into battle lightly. His main weapon was, of course, a bow. In Western Europe, especially the longbow, the English longbow was around 1.8 meters high, while in the southern parts of Europe and in cities, the crossbow was popular. Each weapon had its advantages and disadvantages. The longbow had a high rate of fire, but required lifelong training and great strength. The crossbow didn't need such a strong shooter. It had strong penetration, but a very slow recharge. To give you an idea, an experienced archer could fire around 10 arrows per minute, while a crossbowman could barely fire 1 or 2 shots. Therefore, crossbowmen took cover with large palisades, wooden shields, behind which they charged, while archers relied on rapid fire and mobility. The typical equipment of an archer included more than just a bow. Quiver with arrows. He usually carried 2 quivers of 24 arrows each, for a total of around 48 arrows. The arrows were about 75 to 90 centimeters long. The spikes varied according to the target. Narrow spikes for piercing armor, and wider leaf-shaped spikes for hunting or against unarmored targets. Archers stuck their quivers into the ground in front of them in battle to retrieve arrows more quickly. A smart archer knew that he would not use his bow at close range, so he carried a sword, dagger, or axe as a backup weapon. The English archers at Agincourt are said to have also had war hammers, clubs with which they hammered stakes into the ground and later used them to recharge fallen enemies. Protective equipment, even though archers were not heavily armored, they tried to protect themselves. They often wore a helmet, such as a simple iron hat called a kettle head or a sallet helmet, a quilted jacket, a thick quilted fabric jacket or lighter paneled elements, or a collared shirt. The weight of the armor had to be moderate so that the archer did not lose mobility and could draw the bow. Some also wore forearm protection bracers to protect their hand from the swing of the bowstring. Other essential tools were spare strings. Bowstrings used to be made of hemp or flax impregnated with glue for strength, but moisture could weaken it. Archers therefore wore their bowstrings under their caps or hats to keep them dry. This is where the saying, "keep it under your hat," comes from. The archer also took a simple raincoat, something to eat for the journey, and tools for maintaining the bow. When it came to combat, the archer's tactics varied depending on the situation. In open battle, archers often lined up in ranks and fired arrows in volleys over long distances. Arrows could hit enemies at speeds of up to 200 kilometers, raining down on them like a deadly rain of steel. The sight of a rustling forest of arrows whizzing through the air made even hardened warriors' blood run cold. To counter the cavalry, English archers drove a pointed stake into the ground, the so-called colchi P, to slow down the knight's attack. On the defensive walls, archers fired from covered positions in battlements or loopholes, trying to knock out enemy siege engines or officers before they reached the wall. So their fighting technique wasn't just mindless. Shoot and forget. Good archers could estimate the distance, angle of fire, and wind direction to hit the target. They also collaborated. By firing into a crowd of enemies, they could provoke them into a hasty attack. For example, at Crécy, arrows rained down on the French until the knights lost control and rushed into the attack in chaos. This is exactly what the English were waiting for. The archers thereby disrupted the enemy's formations, which then decided the battle. Yet for an archer, every battle meant enormous risk. If the enemy broke through to the ranks of the archers found themselves in combat, face to face with heavy-armed men with swords and spears. At that moment, the bow went sideways and a close combat ensued, where the lighter-armed archer often pulled on the shorter string. Many archers fell or suffered serious injuries in such clashes. And when they were lucky and were only captured, even that usually did not bode well for them. They were not noble knights for whom someone would pay a ransom. Captured archers often faced a cruel death or mutilation. According to contemporary accounts, French knights threatened to cut off the fingers of English archers so that they would never be able to shoot again. It is even said that this is where the gesture of raising two fingers comes from, a mocking gesture, shown by English archers after the battle to prove their fingers were still intact and ready to fight. Whether this is true or not, the fact remains that the archer could not rely on mercy in battle. If he fell into enemy hands, he could end up on the gallows or hanged. This was also the reason why many archers fought to the last breath rather than give up. So what did it look like when the archer survived the battle and returned to camp or home? Was his daily life at least a little easier? The combat deployment of an archer was one of the most dangerous roles on the medieval battlefield. Let's imagine a scene. It is a cold, drizzly morning, and an enemy army is forming on the horizon. Our archer stands alongside hundreds of his comrades. Fingers stiff with winter grip his bow. Across the field, the gleaming armor of knights can be seen. The commander gives the command, and the archers kneel behind sharp stakes driven into the ground in front of them. "Stretch!" the officer shouts. Dozens of bows bend at the same time as the archers flex all their muscles. Pull. 1,000 arrows shoot into the sky, and within seconds descend upon the enemy from above. A deadly rain of arrows falls. Some pierce shields, others pierce armor or scare horses, throwing riders off course. Imagine that sound, a whizzing sound, and then the crash of metal, the screams of those affected. The knights in the ranks hesitate. Another volley. Their commanders give the order to attack. A heavy charge will be launched directly at the archers. In a few moments, the enemy will be with them.
The shooters don't hesitate. They fire a few last arrows at the approaching riders and then throw away their bows. They reach for swords and axes. A life and death struggle ensues. An archer in light armor dodges a spear early. He knows he wouldn't survive a direct hit. He slashes the horse's legs with his sword, the knight falls to the ground and immediately more archers with knives rush at him. It is chaos, screaming, blood and mud, in which the wounded writhe. If the archer survives the first few minutes of close combat, he may escape either by fleeing to safety behind his own heavy armor or by defeating the enemy. Medieval archers experience such moments countless times in battles. For example, at Agincourt, English archers had to engage in heavy combat after firing an arrow. Many grabbed axes and hammers and rushed to beat the wounded knights in the mud. They had the advantage that the French knights were stuck in a waterlogged field and exhausted, so even a foot archer could overpower the famous nobleman. However, not all battles ended so happily for the shooter. When French cavalry surprised a detachment of English archers at the Battle of Poitiers in 1429, the archers did not have time to drive pegs into the ground or prepare their positions. The French knights literally overran them and killed most of them as they fled. The archers fell to 1,500 and the French victory avenged Agincourt. The fate of the archer on the battlefield hung in the balance. They either gained fame as those who defeated the knights, or ended up hacked to pieces, stabbed, or trampled in the mud somewhere among thousands of other nameless soldiers. But even before the battle, other enemies often came forward. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Medieval campaigns lasted months and soldiers suffered from long marches. It was the archers, mostly common men, who paid the price for the meager supplies. For example, before Agincourt, English archers marched drenched in rain and subsisting only on wild nuts and berries because supplies were running low. Many also died from dysentery, and intestinal infections caused by contaminated water and food. According to chronicles, the English archers were so afflicted with diarrhea before the battle that they fought without trousers, having to cut them off for relief. That's hard to imagine. A frozen archer, weakened by illness, stands half-naked in the mud and still has to draw his bow and face the attacking knights. This horrific scene shows how extreme the conditions were in the field. A soldier often arrived on the battlefield half-dead before he even crossed arms with the enemy. He also did not expect any comfort in the camp. The archers slept under simple tents or just under the open sky by the fire. The food was modest. Hard bread, salted meat or fish, and water or beer, which was safer than water. Hygiene was practically non-existent, so lice and diseases spread. Wounded archers often died of infections because medical care was primitive. Even a small arrow wound could fester and become life-threatening if left untreated. In battle, it also happened that if an enemy arrow remained lodged in the body, field barbers had to painfully cut it out without numbing it. It is not surprising that many of the gunners died shortly after the battle from injuries that would not be fatal today. In short, the battle was literally hell for the archer. He had to overcome fear, physical exhaustion, hunger, and often pain or illness, and still do his job, showering the enemy with arrows. When he managed to survive, he was faced with a return to the harsh reality of camp and later civilian life. But even there, comfort certainly did not await him. We survived the battle. What next? Let's take a look at what a typical day for an archer looked like outside of combat and what his status was in society. Although the storms of war were occasional, the life of a medieval archer was tough even in days of peace. Most archers were not professional soldiers all year round. They were ordinary peasants, artisans, or townspeople who were called up to war only when necessary. When they weren't fighting, they lived much like other people of their class. The morning started with an early rise at dawn in a simple cottage. The archer's breakfast was modest. A piece of black bread, a bowl of warm porridge or soup, buckwheat or peas, and a mug of beer. They drank light beer, but they usually drank it instead of water because the water was often not safe. After breakfast, everyone devoted themselves to their civilian occupation, cultivating the fields, working on the manor, or doing their craft. If it was Sunday, the Mass was followed by archery training at the village shooting range, the so-called archery poles. It was not a choice, but an obligation. Let's imagine a village shooter. In a simple woolen dress, she aims at a straw target in the village square. Neighbors stand around and assess the interventions. This is how they spent their free time. No pampering, more like constant exercise. The archer had to maintain his skill, otherwise he would fail in battle. The archer's home environment used to be very modest. He often lived with his family in a single room in a wooden house. The floor was compacted clay and the roof sometimes leaked. They slept on straw mattresses on the ground, which in the humid climate meant frequent rheumatism and back pain. Which was also helped by archery training. The food was hearty, but simple. Mainly bread, legume porridge, or rather, scythe, a thick soup made from peas, cabbage, herbs, etc., cheese, onions, and sometimes a little salted meat. Meat used to be a luxury. The archer may have raised a pig for his own use, but he only slaughtered it on rare occasions. But when holidays like Christmas came around, it was an opportunity for a feast. Chronicles mention that archers ate roasted goose at Christmas and washed it down with beer or mead. There was also entertainment such as a carol or costume show. These rare moments of joy must have been a stark contrast to an otherwise hard life. The archer's social status was not particularly glamorous, but he nevertheless enjoyed certain privileges. As a trained soldier, he was valued by both king and lord more than an ordinary serf. In England, there was a class of so-called yeomanry, free peasants who often served as archers. They had a slightly higher status than serfs. They owned their own piece of land, for example. For military service, an archer could receive a stipend, typically a few pennies, a penny, per day. It wasn't much. A knight's salary was perhaps 10 times higher, but for a poor peasant, even a few coins a day was a welcome extra income. Moreover, in the event of a victorious battle, booty awaited. Archers could remove parts of armor from fallen enemies or collect valuables after the battle. For example, they walked the battlefields of Agincourt and collected quality French swords and weapons, which they then sold. Some people got more than the full price for this. Still, the nobility sometimes looked down on archers. To many knights, they were lesser warriors who killed from a distance and dishonestly. It was not uncommon for proud lords to despise archers as cowards because they would not put their bodies face to face. But it wasn't until their lives hung in the balance in a hail of arrows that they quickly realized how valuable archers were. Some exceptional marksmen even found their way into the personal service of kings as members of the elite guards. For example, the famous English archery guard was a corps of excellent marksmen who guarded the monarch. There, the archer could completely escape his original poor circumstances. Archers also held a certain honor in legends and culture. Let's remember the figure of Robin Hood, the legendary archer who took from the rich and gave to the poor. Although it is a legend, it reflects admiration for the masters of archery. Ballads and songs explored the accurate aim and bravery of archers. But the shooters' real life wasn't so romantic. Most of them returned to the fields to work the land after the end of the military expedition with sore limbs and scars on their bodies and souls. Many faced the fate of being a war invalid at a relatively young age. Chronic shoulder pain from gunfire, injuries from beatings, impaired vision from guards in discomfort, and so on. Medieval society did not have a sophisticated pension system, so if an archer lost the ability to work, he often fell into poverty. In summary, the medieval archer led a tough life full of toil, sacrifice, and danger. In society, he had the role of an esteemed but not particularly elevated servant of his master. His everyday life was simple and difficult from today's perspective, and the war period was literally a struggle for survival. What can we take from the story of medieval archers today? In conclusion, we will briefly recall their fate and thank you for your attention. The life of a medieval archer in Europe was, without exaggeration, cruel.